Good morning, everyone, and welcome along to this morning's webinar on the topic of navigating club conflict. Now, the title does say that this is for councils and peak bodies, but I'd like to acknowledge that we do have people from a range of organisations joining us this morning. So we certainly have plenty of council officers who look after community sport and recreation organisations. We also have people from peak bodies, so that's national sport and recreation associations, but also student associations as well. And then we do have some people who are directly involved in clubs and associations. So while the topic today is targeted towards helping people help other people, there's certainly a lot of content here today that will help you navigate your conflict as you're going through yourself. So good morning, my name's Michael Connelly. I'm Managing Director of CPR Group, and it's our pleasure to be hosting this webinar this morning, largely in response to lots of feedback that we got coming out of our previous webinar, which was all about the shared use of sporting facilities and how that can lead to lots of conflict. So then to some of the questions in the conversation that occurred after that led us to getting to this point as well. Joining me online this morning also is Courtney Fredrickson. Good morning, Courtney. Courtney will be managing the chats and the questions that go into the poll. So good morning, Courtney.
Good morning, Michael. Sorry, I got my mic on now. Hello, everyone. Please just you can pop your questions in the chat or in the questions, and we will look at those at the end. Thanks.
Fantastic. So you'll see that there's a chat box there. I've invited everyone to start to introduce yourself to get the conversation going, and that's the benefit of attending these types of events live as well. The recording of the session will be available for a couple of weeks after the session has done for those of you who weren't able to make it and will watch it afterwards. But the benefit of being here is to be able to post your questions and to be able to keep the conversation going amongst yourselves as well as with us. So before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of all of the land and the waters where we work, where we walk, where we live, and of course, where we play. We recognise their continuing connection to land, to waters, and to culture, and pay our respects to elders past, present, and emerging, and extend that respect to any First Nations people attending today. This topic is literally the distillation of hundreds of hours of work that we've done over 25 years in working with clubs and associations, with state and national bodies and with councils to help build great community organisations. So while the focus is largely on clubs, that does extend right out to all sorts of community organisations. We have groups that are charities. We have groups that are community organisations that run community centres. We have organisations that are smaller organisations like university clubs and societies. It's interesting that conflict tends to permeate everywhere we go. And so because this is such a broad topic, what we've tried to do is narrow down the focus into what we think are the most important points to begin with and the best starting points. Obviously, we can't cover everything in less than an hour, but we really want to give you some insights into how you can manage conflict and share some tools to be able to do that with you as well. So before we look at how to manage conflict, let's have a look at what conflict is. So if we take a dictionary definition of conflict, we might end up with something that says it's a situation in which we've got people, we've got groups, or even countries, and they're involved in a serious disagreement or argument. I like a shorter definition, and it's a discomforting difference. We have a difference. Two parties have a difference of opinion, a difference of position, a difference of interests, and they discomfort one another. Before we get into managing all conflicts, it's really important to understand that conflict is actually really important. When we're talking about community organisations, if we didn't have conflict in meetings, for instance, then we'd have 5 people in a meeting, all of them agreeing with each other, which would make 4 of them unnecessary. So it's conflict that helps us challenge decisions before we finalise those decisions and make things better. This is really, really important. It's only because of differences of opinion that the world economy goes around. Sales transactions only occur because, for instance, I like to talk about my Nike running shoes. I like to buy them when they're on special, and then I get them for about $150. But sometimes I miss the sales and I have to pay $240 and pay full price for my running shoes. Now, it's only because I value the running shoes more than the $90 extra, and Nike values the $90 extra more than they value the running shoes, that there'll be a transaction, that I'll share my money with them and they'll share their shoes with me. It's also only that there's a difference in opinion on share price, for instance, that there'll be a transaction. I'm going to buy it because I think it's going up. You're going to sell it because you think it's going down. So conflict, by its very definition, is not negative. It's only when the conflict becomes destructive. So all the conflict I've talked about there is constructive. It helps a meeting work. It helps an economy work. But the problem is when we have destructive conflicts, and that's really what we're talking about. And that's what we're hoping to cover off in today's session. So I'd like to then expand that definition and say the problem and what we're really dealing with here is destructive, discomforting differences. So I'd like to begin by running a couple of polls before we get in. And I'd like to check what you think about conflict management. Notice that we're calling it conflict management. The first question here, though, talks about negotiation. How much do you like doing this? So on a scale of 1 to 5, with 1 being I absolutely hate it, and 5 being, yep, I really, really enjoy this, I absolutely love it, where do you think you sit? So you can see as the answers are starting to come in, we've got a lot of people who are saying they're down the lower end. We've got a couple at 4 stars. Still, we've got nobody out there saying, hey, I love managing conflict. I love getting into negotiating situations. Okay, look, that's really not very surprising. Typically, this answer does resolve itself into a bit of a bell curve, and there it is. We can see that bell curve on the screen then. So our average rating is 2.5. So let's now move on to the next poll. And now I'd like you to rate how good you think you are at conflict management. So on a scale from 1 to 5, with 1 being I'm terrible at it, 5 being I think I'm really quite good at it, how do you think you would rate your ability in conflict management before we get into providing some of the tools that can make it a bit easier to negotiate? Okay, so this looks like it's running at about the same. So at the moment, I'll turn those results on so you can see them. We're running a little bit higher. So even to just extrapolate from this data, if we had an average rating of 2.5 for how much we like it, but an average rating of 2.7 for how good at it we are, then you can see that although we might, so even those who like it, although we don't mind doing it, although we're good at it, we still don't necessarily like doing it. So that's quite interesting that has happened, but not particularly surprising. And I'd like to let you know why. Notice that the first question was, how much do you like conflict negotiation? I'd like to introduce the word negotiate. Negotiate comes from the Latin neg, which means not, and otium, which means leisure. So negotiate literally means not leisure. This is not fun. This is not the sort of thing that we want to be getting involved in. So notice that we call it conflict management rather than conflict resolution, and that recognizes that not all conflicts are going to be adequately resolved to the satisfaction of all parties to that conflict. More important, though, it's not about winning. I've tried to teach my kids as a parent, I've tried to teach my kids that the best argument is the one that you're not in, because really, there's no winning a real argument. Even if you are absolutely right, you have all of the facts and you are 100% correct, if you show the other party that you're right, then you'll win now. But what damage does that do longer term to the relationship that you have with that other person or those other people? Now, the bad news is that there's no silver bullet. There's no secrets to making conflict management easy. And even good negotiators don't necessarily enjoy dealing with conflict, but they're brave enough to get in and give it a go. And they know that they have access to some skills and some step-by-step tools, which I'll share with you this morning, to be able to make a good start. So then I'd like to talk quickly about emotions. It's important to understand that there are no magic fixes that are going to turn us human beings into rational thinkers. We like to think that as humans, we are rational, logical, reasonable people who experience emotions. The reality, though, is completely the other way around. We are emotional beings, driven by our emotions, who have had to learn to use reason and logic so that we can have a meaningful society, not the other way around. So the important thing in getting into any form of conflict management is to understand that emotions are perfectly okay. I like to talk about emotions as internal facts. They are real. What you are feeling is real. So it's more than just a psychological feeling. It is a physiological feeling. Now, to prove to you that these are facts, that they are real, I'm going to explain them to you, and you are going to know exactly what I'm talking about when I define the physiological responses to the emotions that you will feel when you enter into a negotiation situation. Firstly, your heart rate is going to elevate. you will be able to sometimes feel your pulse beating in your ears before you enter a discussion that you know is going to be a little bit difficult. It's about here. You'll feel a burning feeling, and that's the feeling of the adrenaline that's coursing through your veins, and you'll actually feel it in your gut. Your hands will shake, and these are all real, and your voice will quiver. You will sound nervous. So all of these things, as you've probably just been nodding along as I've been explaining those, all of these things are absolutely real. So it's really important before you enter into a conflict negotiation situation that we acknowledge the emotions. I have them, being one party to the conflict. The other party also has them. Acknowledging and recognizing emotions and pointing to those emotions can be an amazing icebreaker. Although we have completely different positions and we are defending completely different interests in any topic that the conflict is specifically developed about, we can acknowledge that we are both humans and we both have emotions. And once we do that, we can tend to have a more open and honest discussion, recognizing that the fact that I'm shaking does not make me a weak person. The fact that my voice is quivering does not mean that the interests that I have in trying to resolve this conflict are not noble and valid and at least worth considering. So I think that's really important to get on the table up front, because as we go back and look at those graphs, you can see that the majority of people who don't like conflict, which is, let's be honest, it's all of us, it's because of this. I don't like that feeling. I don't like the adrenaline that I get here. I don't like the cortisol pumping through my veins, stopping my immune system from working because I'm nervous and I'm worried about the fight or flight syndrome. Let's acknowledge that, and then we can have a much more reasonable, balanced discussion. Conflict management is very similar to your leadership ability. So we're going to start this discussion this morning by working through how you can manage conflicts when you are a party to that conflict. But I want you to see that from the lens of where you sit. So we will round it out by sharing with you some specific tools for helping other parties, when you're a third party, helping other parties negotiate. But it's really important to understand how you would negotiate if you were one of those parties. But the tactics are exactly the same all the way through. So when you are trying to assist others to negotiate, it is a form of leadership. But the important thing about leadership is that the leadership that we demonstrate externally, our external ability to help others through situations like managing their conflict, is like the tip of a very, very big iceberg. And that iceberg is then built on a foundation of self-leadership, which is built on an understanding of our self-awareness. This is really, really important. And I won't spend too long on this morning, but when we do spend time in longer conflict management training sessions for staff members at councils, at peak bodies, and conflict management training sessions for clubs themselves, this is probably the most important part of the session. Because it's only by understanding ourselves, our drivers, our motivators, and our personality types or our personality traits that we can then control our own behavior in an effort to have that behavior better influence those around us to achieve the results that we're trying to achieve. So what it is once I understand the different types of personalities that there are, now I don't mind whether you're thinking about the DISC profiling, about Myers-Briggs type indicators, about Clifton Strengths, about the Ocean model, which talks about my openness, my extroversion, my agreeableness, my conscientiousness, and yes, my neuroticism. It's just important to understand that we are different people and we have different drivers. We have people who are introverts and people who are extroverts. We have people who are really good on details and people who hate the details and just say, but look at the big picture. Once we understand that there are different types, and we don't need to get into too much of a discussion about it, but to run through a short exercise, and you can start this at least with a 10-minute web search on personality types, at least to give you an understanding that there are different drivers. To work through it, we do it a little bit tongue-in-cheek because we're not trying to focus on your personality types or how that can be right or wrong, because we all have everything. The important thing to understand is that what drives me, if I am the big picture thinker, is going to mean that the people who are focused on the detail are probably going to rub me up the wrong way, and vice versa. The people, if you are one of the detail-oriented people, The people who just say, yeah, but forget about the details. Let's just look what's possible and look how big this can be. They're probably going to drive you nuts because you're thinking, hang on a minute, but how are we going to make that work? Yes, I understand that you're excited about the opportunity for that to work, but how are we going to make that work? And so it's really important to understand that there are differences of opinion and there are differences of personality types, and we are all different people. So once we understand that, we can only ever adjust our own behavior. I can't, no matter how much you tell me about what you're thinking and what you're feeling, I can't think it and feel it in your place. I can only interpret how you are interpreting a feeling and turning it into words to tell me that. So that's critical to understand. In reality, all we can do is look for what I call data points. What are the indicators that show me what a person is like, and therefore help me to use my own self-awareness to be aware of what I am like, to adjust my behavior, the self-leadership, to then have a better opportunity of being heard and understood when it's time for me to get my point across to that person. So the fact that I'm going to move on now, please don't see that as the fact that this is not important. I think, as I said, that this is probably the most important part of understanding how we can adjust our own behavior to influence that of others. But in the interest of time, I'd like to move on now to what I call the different types of conflict management tactics. And I figured that it's probably best to present these as a bit of a matrix. And on that matrix, we've got on our y-axis, we've got our concern for self. How concerned about the outcomes for me am I? And on the x-axis then, how concerned am I for the results for the other party here? So if we start in the bottom left corner where I have low concern for me and low concern for the other, the conflict management tactic that will fall here is called avoidance, where I'm simply going to avoid talking about the conflict at all, because obviously I'm so scared of it, or the conflict itself is so important to it taking its own path that I'm going to put my needs and the needs of the other person completely to the side and just walk away from it altogether. So this is what we call a lose-lose conflict management tactic. To then move up from here, if I have high concern for me and low concern for the other, this would be competition. So this would be win-lose. I need to win at your expense. It's also not necessarily very good. The opposite to that, so the diagonally opposite, is accommodation. So this is where I have a lower concern for me, but a higher concern for the other party. So I would take a lose-win tactic approach here and look for an outcome that, sure, it resolves the situation, but it doesn't necessarily resolve it in a way that is satisfactory to me. Then high concern for self and high concern for other leads to collaboration, or really the most important of these so far, which is a win-win outcome. In some instances, it's very easy to say, oh, throw your hands in the air and roll your eyes and say, Michael, that is absolutely not possible. There is no way that we can achieve a win-win outcome here. And for the most part, I would politely disagree. Partly. The way that I'm going to agree is that there's no way to get to achieve a win-win if you're just looking at a steamroller approach, because where you're going to end up is win-lose or lose-win. The steamroller approach is also quick, so it might achieve an outcome quickly, but it's not necessarily going to be an outcome that's going to have long-lasting benefits. The difficulty with collaboration and seeking a win-win outcome is it's the difficult one. It's the one that takes time. It's the one that takes an investment of time and energy over time so that you are in a position to be able to identify what are the synergies that exist here that unless we work together, we won't find. If we look at our conflict as a zero-sum game, like a game of netball, for my team to win, your team must lose. Negotiation is not like that. In most cases, it's because we need to look behind the argument itself and identify why the two parties to that argument have taken the positions they have. What are their interests? What are they trying to achieve? And are there collaborative ways that we can achieve that that's a little different from just me getting my way or you getting your way? There's a less mature tactic in here, and it's compromise. So it's what we call a no-win, no-lose situation. The problem with compromise, though, is that it kind of means that we both have to give a little to arrive somewhere in the middle. A good example of compromise might be if I really like my brown shoes, but my partner really prefers me to wear my black shoes, And so we compromise and I wear one black shoe and one brown shoe. Obviously, that's a worse outcome than just wearing the black or just wearing the white. But that's why compromise is seen in the middle there as kind of, it's very similar to avoidance, but specifically to say, I don't want to lose, I don't want to win, you don't want to lose, you don't want to win, so let's just find some middle ground. Probably the most mature form of conflict management tactic that we can deal with here, though, is to understand that when we reach a point that we can't get a win-win outcome, what are the ways that we can say, no deal, but let's agree to disagree, but do so agreeably. So how is it that we can move on without resolving this conflict, but with also without having an impact on our future relationship? In the worst cases, that might mean separating the relationship altogether. But there are other opportunities to be able to say, well, on this point, we can't reach an agreement, so then we can move on and leave it unresolved, but to do so in an agreeable fashion. So that's really the ultimate level of maturity when it comes to conflict management tactics, is how can we achieve a win-win? And if we can't achieve a win-win, that we can agree to disagree, but both do so walking away with a little smiley emoji on our face. So let's now look at dysfunctional conflict management strategies. I'm going to go through these fairly quickly, and this is really important. And I think that it's important to start with dysfunctional strategies first, because in doing so, it's kind of like holding a mirror up. When I look into that mirror, I can see, you know what, I use these strategies quite a bit. And now I understand why the results that we've achieved, while they may have worked short term, they weren't effective in the long term. So that's important, because it's by understanding these 7 dysfunctional strategies that we have a better opportunity to then not use those strategies as we start to apply a more sophisticated approach, following a toolbox approach to managing conflicts and looking for those win-win scenarios as much as we can. In our specific training that we provide here, we run scenarios in each of these. We look for examples where they have arisen, and then because by telling stories around people's use of these tactics, of these different dysfunctional conflict management strategies, it gives you a really interesting insight to dig deeper into, say, okay, so this is where and how that situation, why that's a dysfunctional strategy, but sometimes where we may employ part of that dysfunctional strategy to give us an opportunity to move to a more sophisticated and a strategy that does give us a better chance of success. So we're going to start with where we started on the previous slide. We're going to start with avoidance. Avoidance is a dysfunctional strategy because all it is hoping that the situation will just blow away and it will move on. We change the topic all the time. Sometimes we completely withdraw, or at least withdraw from seeing the other party to the conflict. The reason that it's dysfunctional is that, as you know, if you leave situations unattended, they get worse. They fester. Worse though, over time you can also lose credibility and get a name for not being able to deal with problems. I had a situation which was actually quite sad, where there was one of the ladies involved in the program that we were working on, when the situation came up that we had to resolve, and this is why we were engaged, to resolve this situation and to be able to build a more functional strategic plan for this organization. Unfortunately, she said, I don't do conflict, made gestures like this, and stood up and left and never came back. Now, I know that she was a fantastic operator. I know that she had more in the tank, but because she was unable to have skills and to have a toolbox of steps that she could take to deal with conflict, even to the point of having the discussion, she removed herself not only from the conflict, but from the organization. The next part is imposition. So imposing a solution on the other party. So imposition can be overt or covert. It's overt when somebody in a position of senior authority, so in a work setting, for instance, a manager tells a subordinate, this is what you're doing, and there's no negotiation entered into at all. But it can be covert, where you've got 2 people who are on the same line in an org chart, and one of those goes behind the other's back to go to a senior person to then impose a solution down. And I didn't know that was happening. Therefore, I haven't been given a fair opportunity to present my case in a conflict management scenario. Obviously, there are plenty of problems here because it can cause the other party to do the same to you. and it causes resentment between these two. Similarly, triangulation is where we've got two parties to a dispute, and one of those goes to an external third party, so somebody who is not a party to the dispute. Now, that in itself sounds like it could be a great conflict management strategy. But when it's triangulation, you'll know this because you're not actually going to the other party to seek a solution or a resolution. You're going to the other party to bitch and moan. It becomes a venting session. Now, the problem here is that venting typically makes you madder, and it can mean that cliques can develop over time. In a workplace setting, whether that's a paid workforce or a volunteer workforce, and I'd say the volunteer workforce is probably more important to retain, to build trust, what it can do is develop an environment of competition, when what we should be doing is setting an environment of teamwork and a culture of teamwork. So that's where triangulation and venting and speaking behind other people's backs is dysfunctional. The next one is manipulation. So this is using indirect means to achieve a goal without even letting the other party know. It can be telling lies. It can be not revealing your true motivation when you're trying to seek a change in behavior from another party. An example might be a club executive telling new people who they're trying to get onto the committee, honestly, it's only going to take you maybe 10 minutes. And you know what? I'm going to be there to help you the whole time. That's not truthful. The thing about manipulation is that it's going to work. It typically works. And it can be carrots or it can be sticks. So it can be manipulation by me telling you, if you do this, then this is the reward you'll receive. Or if you do not do this, then this is the punishment that you can expect. Manipulation is effective because those are typically drivers. The problem, though, is that it's effective short term. If there's a reward given for a particular behavior type, then that sets the new status quo. And there's an expectation that I will always need to receive that award before I will change my behavior again. Or if there's a punishment, then it's, well, I didn't really want to do it in the first place. I did it because I didn't want the punishment. So that can cause people to withdraw completely. So when should you use manipulation? Never. You're always going to get found out. And so you might say, but hang on, what if I really need to get something done? If you really need to get something done, then we jump back up to imposition and say, well, hang on, if this is critical, and say I'm an incident controller in a bushfire scenario and I absolutely need my team to do things, then I'm going to impose that by my position of authority and the fact that I'm in this position because I have the ability, the knowledge and the experience to be able to make those decisions. Manipulation, you will always get found out. The next one is absolute framing. So this is creating a false dichotomy, saying it's black or it's white. You're with me or you're against me. It's a yes, it's a no. Take it or leave it. The problems with absolute framing is that by saying it's at one end of the spectrum or it's at the complete other end of the spectrum, it misses opportunities for collaboration. It misses the potential for finding where are these synergistic opportunities in the middle where we can find and implement a true win-win situation. The next one is another one to avoid all the time. It's revenge. The problem with revenge, though, is it's fun. We love getting the other person back. Revenge means doing harm to the other party deliberately in an effort to get back at them for something that you perceive that they've done to you. So this can be as simple as withholding information. So not including them in a messenger group, in a messenger chat, or not including them in an email trail. Just like manipulation, you will always get found out. And again, an element of revenge is always building an environment of competition when what we need is teamwork and collaboration. And the final one on the list is compromise. So remember my story about the black shoes and the brown shoes. What compromise typically does is says, well, let's not try and invent something that's outside of the box thinking. Let's just look at what we've got, find somewhere in the middle. We can both give enough that we're, oh, right then. But very often, compromise means 1 + 1 = 1.5. It's a worse outcome for everyone overall. Yet if in looking for that win-win or no deal outcome, we take the time that's required, we can look for and then chase outcomes that are of a much higher value. So let me run my next poll and ask, how many of these dysfunctional strategies do you think that you have used in the past when dealing with conflict? Is it none of them? I've never used any. I've used 1 or 2. I've used 3 or 4, or I've used all of them. Now, as the votes start to come in, I can see that a number of you have used a number of these tactics. I'd like to guess that the reason that you've used them is because we know them. But were the outcomes of using these strategies as expected? Did you expect that we would have an outcome from using manipulation, for instance, that was short term? Should we have said, actually, this is really important, we're going to impose this decision, and then we're going to deal with the fallout short term because we know it's going to lead to longer term benefits? Have you settled for compromise, now realizing that had you taken a bit of extra time, you may have been able to come up with a solution that was truly win-win? So just because you've used these in the past is perfectly okay. It's perfectly okay that you've used them, and that may simply be because you didn't have a more sophisticated approach to conflict resolution. So let me now set out some of these steps for you. In creating proper, effective conflict management outcomes, let's start by setting the goals. Goal setting in exactly the same way as if we're doing any sort of planning, and here we're planning for how we're going to resolve a conflict. In doing any sort of planning, it's really important that we have an understanding of where we're trying to get to. But I'd like to divide these goals down into 4 different types of goals. The first one we'll call substantive goals. So we're dealing with a conflict. There is something going on and we want an outcome, and I can actually define that outcome fairly clearly by saying, this is the situation, this is how I want it resolved. But in setting the substantive goal, you can't just look at it from your standpoint. I like to say that there are at least as many sides to a story as there are parties to that story. The more you can try and understand where the other parties are coming from, and this is why understanding the different personality types, therefore the different approaches that people may have in entering a discussion or a negotiation setting, then the more you'll be able to see things from their point of view, the more you'll be able to genuinely put yourself in their shoes and say, right, well, if I was in their shoes, then I can see why this is important to them. The next one is relationship goals, and this is why the short-term manipulation wins are ineffective, because over time, you will need to maintain some form of relationship with the other party or parties to the dispute. Think about neighbourhood disputes over things like fences. It never ceases to amaze me how many people end up in small claims courts all around the country over something as trivial as the type of fence or where the fence or how much it's going to cost. And they fight to the point of taking each other to court, not realizing that these people need to see each other every time they back out of their driveway. So what's more important here? Is it more important to just win, or is it more important to have a longer term discussion that can find the win-win, the potential there for the win-win outcome that then protects the relationship over time? The third one is critical. This is critical, and this is where working in the not-for-profit sector, I think, is vastly different from working in the for-profit sector. When we work in government or when we work in for-profit business, the substantive goals may be primary. If we are seeking shareholder value, then maybe that's the most important thing. Maybe maintaining relationships with other parties is less important, and so it's the outcome that we want to maximize shareholder value that's critical. When we get into the not-for-profit sector, however, maintaining those relationships longer term can be much more important, because those relationships are with future long-term volunteers. Those relationships are with future long-term members. Those relationships are with future long-term sponsors of our organisation or other forms of investors like grant agencies. So it's critical that we focus on those. But then we come to identity goals. An identity goal in conflict management looks at how I wish to see myself after this conflict is resolved, as well as how I wish other people to perceive me after this conflict is resolved. But how do you see yourself? How does the other party see themselves going into the conflict, and how do they want to be seen coming out of it? What's critical to understand is that some people in the community sector take on a role, take on a leadership position on a committee, and that's where they get a sense of identity and a feeling of some level of authority. So there are some people who take on a role on a committee because in their work life, they carry no power. In their home life, they may feel that they carry very limited power. And so taking on a role, and this is certainly not a generalization, it is a subset of people who volunteer, but many of those, that subset is still very big. And many of those people volunteer purely because of the identity that it creates for them. Think about that word identity. This is who I am. So it exists very deeply buried in the oldest parts of our brain. We are connected to that. And then we as humans, being these emotional beings, will act consistently with our identity of ourselves, how we identify with ourselves. So you need to understand your identity. How do I wish to be seen at the end of this? So if I am in a position of, say, a community development officer or a sport and recreation officer in a peak body in a council, do I want to be seen as a police officer coming and imposing a decision? Do I want to be seen as a confidant, somebody in whom people will confide? Do I want to be seen as a trusted advisor? Do I want to be seen as a friend? Now, of those, trusted advisors probably the most valuable, but unless you understand that from the beginning, unless you say that's how I wish to be seen by the other parties to this conflict or this dispute, I don't necessarily know the steps that I need to take to stay there. But when I've got clarity over that for myself, then I can adjust my behavior, self-awareness, self-leadership, to make sure that I'm giving the best leadership signals that that's what I want. But more importantly, how can I adjust my behavior to understand that there are some things that I can say that will actually deeply upset people? It's right for me to say to my friend, hey, you're the president of the club. You probably shouldn't be the one picking up the rubbish. Or you probably shouldn't be the one standing behind the bar for free for 8 hours a day. But for her, that is how she sees herself. So for me to say that, now, in my opinion, as somebody who works in this sector and who knows about good governance, I'm right. I'm 100% right. But in that case, I'm potentially losing a friend. I'm potentially losing my trusted advisor status in my ability to say anything else because I've missed the way that they see themselves. So that is critical. And the final one is then the process goals. So what are the steps that I wish to go through to be able to resolve or at least manage this conflict, getting through to a win-win situation or identifying where we've got a no-deal separation? So let's now get into these effective conflict management strategies. And before we do, and I'll walk you through a series of steps, but before we do, there are two conditions that are required before you can enter into any conflict management strategies. The first one is that you do need to be able to define the issue in terms of voluntary behavior from my side and the side of the other party from now forward. Voluntary behavior means I have a choice here. From now forward recognizes that no matter how hard I try, I can't change the way that I behaved yesterday. Yesterday is gone and I can't go back and adjust the way that I behaved then. So that's very important to understand. So we need to understand that we're looking from now forward. And the second point is that both parties must be willing and able to negotiate. There's two parts to that. Willing to negotiate. We must be willing to say, yes, I'm interested in finding a resolution to this situation, and able, which means that I must have authority to be able to act on behalf of the other people that I may represent in working through to a valid resolution. Now that's important because there's nothing worse than investing that time, taking the step back and saying, all right, this is important to invest the time in looking for the win-win scenario, only to get to 3 or 4 meetings in, and then for the other party to say, well, look, that's fantastic, Michael. Thank you very much for your time. I'll now run that by the rest of the committee and see if we've got any more changes. And you're thinking, well, this is a problem. Maybe I should have been involving the others at that part as well. So if there are more people that are going to be influencing the decision to agree to a negotiated agreement or not, involve them from the beginning, not the end, because that's a lot of time that you will have invested that may need to be reinvested then. So let's now walk through the 7 effective conflict management steps. The first 4 start with preparation, but I'm telling you a furphy because there's actually the first 5. There's a step 0. Step 0 is understand that we have emotions and get them in check. So it's okay to point to them exactly as we said at the start. It's okay to say, I have emotions, I need to understand emotions, and I need to let you know that I'm feeling them, and let's talk about them. So that's the first step, and that's very important. In running scenario planning in our conflict management training for different sorts of groups, we actually run provide some exercises for how to do this, and they're amazingly powerful. Step number one then is to very clearly define the issue. And by defining the issue, I mean grab a pen or a pencil and write it down. But you need to be able to, again, write the issue down in terms of the voluntary behavior from now forward. So we're not talking about, we don't want to define the issue by saying that other person is being an idiot, because that doesn't help. What we can say is that other person is behaving in this way, and that is having an impact on me or our organization because. That's how you can define the issue. But it needs to be very clear, and it needs to be based on behavior and not accusations of being things like idiots. Step number two is then identify the goals. So in exactly as those 4 goals that we went through, what are our substantive goals? So what is it that I want to get as an outcome here? But what is it? What may also it be for the other person? And look at each of these from both sides. How important is my relationship with the other party at the end of this negotiation? How important is it that I appear as I see myself to them? How do I see them? Really importantly, how do they see themselves, and how do I need to adjust my behavior in effectively dealing with them? Step number 3 then is to put all of this together and make the decision. Do we want to negotiate? Do we want to look for a negotiated agreement to deal with the conflict that we are party to right now? In making that decision, look to how easy it was to do step 1 and step 2. If it was really easy to define the issue, and it was really easy to set all of those goals, starting with the first one, what is the substantive goal, then it's probably going to be a fairly effective discussion that you can have when you go into the negotiation itself. But if that was difficult, then it might be time to start to think about, what does no deal look like? William Ury and Roger Fisher, in their great book, Getting to Yes, talk about your BATNA, best alternative to a negotiated agreement. So what if we can't reach an outcome? Then these are the steps that we could take to now separate, to say this is not a resolution. We're not going to be able to achieve a resolution to this disagreement. So maybe we are better off separating. What does that look like? And then what can I go and do to continue being effective in my role without achieving a negotiated outcome on that particular dispute? Critically here, though, if you make the decision to negotiate, don't delay. Get into it. Because if you delay from that point, that's a form of avoidance. And remember, avoidance, low concern for me, low concern for the other, and avoidance was number 1 in our dysfunctional conflict management strategies. Step number 4 is to arrange the meeting. Now, this is not just about setting a time. This is about giving the other party very clear details as to why you are arranging to meet with them. I'd like to meet with you to to discuss this particular issue. Don't do it on the spot, because that doesn't give them a chance to prepare. The reason that I say give them a chance to prepare is that it's what I like to call the no surprises principle. There should be no surprises in the way that in why I am seeking a meeting with you, and there should be no ambiguity about what that meeting is. So then we get into the actual negotiation itself. Step 5 is meet. Have the meeting that we've just arranged in step 4. So come prepared to that meeting to explain your point of view and offer suggestions, but don't overly commit to your own solution, because what that does is it's blocking you into competition. It's blocking you into a win-lose scenario because you're looking only at your own side. Really, you are being very clear that this is about looking for collaboration. How is it that we can achieve a win-win outcome here? So when you are in the meeting, take the lead. The reason that you should take the lead is you ask for the meeting. Begin by thanking the other person and restate the issue. And this is very important because we can do that now. Setting a very clear definition of the issue was step 1. So we can do that. We can make sure that our understanding of the issue is consistent with theirs. Then we get into listening. It's very important that we listen to their points of view, and don't listen to respond. Listen to genuinely understand, because it's only when we understand things from their point of view that we will be in a position to be able to adjust our own behavior to understand how we can work towards a win-win outcome. And the final point there is focus on interests, not positions. So both parties have taken a position, and those positions are a discomforting difference that has obviously worked at being destructive to get us to this point. But there's a reason why we've taken those positions. What is it that we're trying to achieve that sits behind those positions? What are the reasons we've taken those positions? Therefore, what are our interests? Because when we move away from position and into interest, that's when we can start to see, oh, well, we can achieve some of your interests by taking a completely different pathway. There's a great story of two grown men in a cafeteria fighting over the last orange on the countertop. And they literally end up wrestling on the floor until they decide, well, let's just cut it in half, and they each take half, so they compromise. But then it's only by asking an extra question that the person serving at the cafeteria said, hey, why did you want the orange anyway? And one of them said, well, I needed the pulp because I was going to make orange juice out of it. And the other person said, well, I needed the skin because I wanted to make marmalade. If we had had that discussion, if we had looked at the interests, not just, I want the orange, why do I want the orange? Then we would have said, well, actually, we can both end up with 100% because we want different things from the same thing. So step number 6 then is to make a contract. Making a contract doesn't need to be written. For small conflicts, a verbal agreement can typically be enough. Sure, you might back that up with an understanding on email about what the next steps are. But for small resolutions, to not put it in writing can demonstrate a level of trust, specifically when we're talking about small things. Obviously, larger things like negotiating a 10-year agreement, for instance, does require a written contract, but some of them don't, and that's perfectly okay. But what if you can't reach agreement? And this is where it's important to understand what our BATNA is. So what's our best alternative to a negotiated agreement, and how might we move towards that? And finally, follow through. Once we come up with a resolution, we do what we said we would do, but we also check in with the other party and make sure that they are doing what they said that they would do as well. And that's very important. It's only if they're not meeting their end of the bargain that we can reopen the negotiation and go back to step 5 and have another discussion with them. But if they are following through, acknowledge that they're following through and thank them, because we had a conflict that has led us to the point to need to negotiate an outcome to that conflict. So it's important that we pay them the respect to then go back and thank them for what they've been doing. Now let's bring this together by saying, if I'm not one of the parties to the dispute, how can I take exactly the same approach as that outsider? And this is where a lot of you sit in your role as staff members at peak bodies, at councils, at student associations, to be able to say, what is the role that I can play? So let's start with some simple steps here. Number 1 is avoid triangulation. It's very tempting to be the knight in shining armor and to take sides. But as soon as you take sides, you're not impartial, and therefore you're not in the best position to be able to help. Avoid the temptation to be the rescuer, to listen to only one party's side of the problem. Remember that there are at least as many sides to a story as there are parties to that story. Number 2 then is, again, both parties must agree. Both parties must agree that they are going to enter into seeking a negotiated outcome. Both parties must be able to achieve an outcome that is then that they can actually go and implement. But they also both must agree that you're going to be able to help them. Number 3 then is to validate their feelings. Nothing here is new. We are just taking a structured step-by-step approach in helping them through the process. Yes, I understand that everyone has emotions. We are emotional beings who have had to learn to think rationally and behave rationally. Acknowledge that and help them understand that. But remember, avoid triangulation and remain impartial. It may be important, depending on the nature of the dispute, to set some rules here and to make sure that everybody remains calm. And number 5 then is guide them through the steps. As the independent third party, you're often in a very good point to help with step 6, which is to establish what that contract is. What is the agreement here that we're making, and how can we make sure that it is written in very clear language that we all understand? And the important thing about that agreement is that each point needs to be clear. So not only do we need to understand what everybody's going to do, but are there dependencies? Does somebody need to do something before somebody else here? Because how often have you been in a meeting where everyone says, yes, this is what's happening, everyone goes away knowing what they've got to do, but I'm waiting on Susie to do what she's doing, and Susie's waiting on me to do what I'm supposed to do, because we didn't get clarity on the order that these things were supposed to occur or the dependencies. So it's very important that there's no ambiguity. So what that means is take your time. Take the time that is required to be able to reach the negotiated agreement that is best. In cases where you can't achieve a negotiated solution either by yourself if you're party to the agreement, or as that third party, that assistant to the situation, then you can look to escalate. So where can you escalate? Firstly is internally. Are there elements internally where we can escalate this? So if the dispute is between two members of an incorporated association, can they escalate that to the management committee? But then can it be escalated externally? So can we seek assistance from our peak body, from a regional association, from our state or national body? Sometimes the answer will be yes, but quite often, if that dispute is an internal dispute, then the ability for that external party, our peak bodies, to intervene may be limited to providing that assistance that we've just been through as the third party. But there are then professional mediation services available, and these are available for low or no cost through government dispute resolution centres or through professional mediation agencies. The third point there is our Club Mentor program. So Club Mentor, as I'll talk about in a moment, is our program where we provide ongoing assistance to community organisations. Now, whether we provide that directly to incorporated associations or to those incorporated associations by an agreement with a council or a state or national body, a lot of the time that we spend is helping to manage these conflicts. But very importantly, the work that we do through Club Mentor actually sets to avoid conflicts in the first place through effective induction programs, through effective training programs, effective planning programs, making sure that policies, constitutions, bylaws are all valid and up to date. Then sets us in a position where the conflict that may have occurred in the future doesn't occur at all. And finally, there may be some cases where legal intervention is required. So if in doubt, if somebody is in potential harm, then seek legal intervention as well. If it's an emergency, always call 000. If in doubt, contact your local police. And the local police 131 444 is the police link line. And obviously they're seeking more people to do that online. But if in doubt, don't sit wondering. Make the call and seek an expert opinion. The final point to make, though, is the absolute importance of applying the principles of natural justice. Natural justice means that if there is an allegation made against me, I have every obligation to understand the nature of that allegation and to be given a chance to defend myself. Go out of your way to apply the principles of natural justice in every conflict situation that arises. That is really, really important. And as I said, go out of your way to do it. It's unfortunate that the majority of cases that we see get escalated to Supreme Courts, for instance, in incorporated associations, are due to a denial of natural justice at some point in the dispute mediation or dispute management process. So as I said, our Club Mentor program is probably the best thing to introduce at this point because it is there to head off at the pass all of the problems that can arise. So it's possibly the new committee or board member induction program that is the most important here because it sets a foundation for everyone to understand their rights, but also to understand their obligations. But it also sets us up as the backstop. So if there's a question, I don't know where to go, then that's why the program was established, so that we know that without needing to establish another arrangement to provide formal advice or guidance, that arrangement already exists. And so we can be there early to take the little steps to solve a little problem before the avoidance means that those little problems become big problems and then the steps become much bigger. And unfortunately, at that point, usually much more expensive or more damaging to an organisation over time. So I encourage you to have a look at our Club Mentor program at cprgroup.com.au/Club Mentor. At this point, I'd like to see if there are any questions that we should go through. So Courtney, are there any questions or comments that have come up in the chat that we should look through?
There has been only one question so far in the chat, which was about making the slides available. So they will be available on our website. So we'll send an email out to everyone with those how to access the resources. And I've just seen a question come in. Is there a cost to be part of the program for the group, or is it just for us?
There's an established program there. So if you have a look at the website, you'll see what it involves. And the cost is set at about $3,500 a year. And that's basically then it works as an ongoing subscription basis. And you'll see all of the inclusions in that program as well.
And one more question, any advice on dealing with complaints?
So yeah, this is a quite a common question. So you need to understand that sometimes complaints are different from conflict. It depends on the nature of the complaint. If a complaint is obviously vexatious or malicious, then it makes sense to say, okay, well, look, we'll take that one privately. There are some opportunities, and especially if these complaints are coming in through social media where they are very public, complaints can actually be an opportunity to go over and above and to be seen publicly to be going over and above. So if a complaint is genuinely to do with a mistake that you have made, then to acknowledge that mistake and to go and correct that mistake publicly and quickly and honestly can actually be an amazing brand builder. So I don't know if you remember the story of a few years ago of somebody who had complained on Facebook about one of the supermarkets selling them a rotten avocado and putting photos of the rotten avocado there. And then the supermarket chain got online straight away and said, oh, I'm terribly sorry, and then went over and above to compensate the dude who'd had the rotten avocado. So that then, the cynic in me says, was the whole thing set up from the beginning? But complaints are a free opportunity for improvement. The important thing is don't be stubborn in saying, well, hang on a minute, that doesn't exist. That's not actually a problem. Because if it exists to somebody and it's not just purely vexatious or malicious, then there is something in it. It is true, even if it's true for them. So is it an opportunity for you to improve your services as well? And then if there are complaints that may be longer term, then going through exactly the process that we've talked about here can be suitable. If the complaint is, this is my situation, this is where I want something done differently, then that's where we're starting to look behind, okay, this is what you're saying you want done differently. Let's look at the reasons that sit behind that. And is there another part of our service or offering that you're missing that you could have access to? Here's another one I've just seen, Courtney, come in from for an incorporated association, what mediation services may be available. The government dispute resolution centres are available. And Cheryl, depending on where you are, if you have a look at your state association, then, okay, so you're in Queensland, so that's great. Then it's the Queensland government definitely has a dispute resolution centre. And of course, we can provide that sort of assistance as well. Anything else there, Courtney?
One just comment from Karen there in the questions. So as council, we are often required to protect council interests and adhere to planning restrictions, hence not always an equal playing field for negotiation. Definitely.
So, and this is when we look at a longer term training program, we also look into what are the 4 steps to the 4 principles of good principle-based negotiation. And one of those is understanding the objective standards that exist. So if there are rules, and I can see Blake's question, where does tenure rank amongst the list of conflict issues? Very high, Blake, typically, it commonly comes up there. But it's often for exactly the same reason. We've got this objective standard, so that can be a planning scheme, rules around planning, local area planning that say this is what goes here and this is what therefore doesn't go here. Tenure can be the same. A tenure agreement can say, it's a contract. You will have access to our land and facilities for a certain amount of time, in return for which you will pay a certain fee. We will do some of the maintenance, you will do other parts of the maintenance. The reason that, and this is building on our previous session as well, the reason that tenure agreements typically lead to quite a large number of conflicts, either between co-tenants at the same facility or between the tenants and the lessor, typically being a council, is because of a lack of application of those objective standards. We have rules. If we softly keep making sweetheart deals for organisations, some of which may be historical, a handshake there in the 1960s may be reason enough for a council to say, well, we're not going to apply this consistently in this case because they're a special case. The more those special cases happen, the more those special cases become the norm, and then there is no norm because everyone is different. And then when you say, well, hang on a minute, now it's time to apply everything that was in the rules, that's when the stink gets kicked up. And so it's important to set criteria and then apply those criteria consistently, recognizing that sometimes the application of that criteria for the first time and tenure renewal is always the best time to do this, because this is the point at which you are now signing a document that you need to read because you are accountable for what it says, because you will be signing this under seal or at least having it legally endorsed. So this is at the point at which we are agreeing for you to be taking on this maintenance. So that's the point to apply it. But do it like a Band-Aid, because although it might, and it may even lead to some volunteer organisations approaching the media and getting media coverage to say, oh, how nasty is council, they're making us paint our own building. Or how nasty is council, they're making us pay for our own electricity to turn the lights on. If that's not the case, and it may sound a little ridiculous, but unfortunately it happens all too often. So if that's the case, set and apply the criteria as quickly as you can. So in some cases, especially at tenure renewal, the off with the Band-Aid approach is often best. At other times though, it's a very clear telegraphing the punch. This is what's coming, and it will be absolutely 100% in play from the 1st of January 2024. So in our move to that point, these are the things that will be changing over time. And I remember when GST came in and my fees for going over the Gateway Bridge every time increased from $2, not to $2.20, but to something more than that. It was because they telegraphed the punch. They said, oh, we've just realized that in leaving the toll payment at $2 for so long, we've unfortunately now we're behind CPI. So we need to put it up, and this is how we're going to do that. So let them know that. Let them know that this is coming. But also when you're pushing it into the future, it means that people can still enjoy a slight modification to the status quo rather than the big hit. But if you've got the reason for the big hit, and that can be a redevelopment, so new facilities coming in, and or a new agreement, then that can be a great catalyst for saying, well, now we're applying these. But if not, then they're already there. Say we are making sure that we are applying these. And you've got to remember, particularly for our council friends with us this morning, that you have an obligation not just to the tenants, you have an obligation to every single ratepayer who is part funding that tenant's ability to be where they are. So that's really important. Karen agrees, yes, consistency with lease agreements is key. We have a lot of historical agreements with old clauses. Yeah, exactly. So that's the point at which renewal comes, that you can then say, right, well, this is it. But it's not what's written in the agreement that matters here, Karen. Keep in mind that the important thing here is the discussions and the conversations that you are having with those tenants, so that as the new agreement timeframe comes up, they are aware of what their new obligations will be well before they sign it. They can then make a decision. Do they want to sign it? Or do they perhaps want to vacate? That then means there's an EOI process for somebody else to come and take on management for that centre. Do those people who are involved maybe not want to stay involved, so they can take a step back and implement their own internal succession planning program to then be able to find other people who can come and get involved? So to finish off the session there, if you're not already connected with us through our newsletter, you can join our newsletter mailing list at cprgroup.com.au. You can follow us on all of the social channels as well. And as you leave the session today, you'll see that there's a little survey that you can complete. And one of the important questions towards the end of it, there's only a couple of questions in there, but one of the important questions is, do you have ideas for future topics? So this session and the previous session are both in response to answers to those questions. So I certainly encourage you to put ideas down for future sessions as well. As we said, the recording of this session will be available for a couple of weeks after the session, so we'll get that available and then notify everyone when that happens. That'll be available on our website. And of course, if you're watching a recording of this session and you don't get the survey, then if you've got ideas for future sessions, please just shoot us a quick email and you can go to the Contact Us section of our webpage to be able to do that as well. Courtney, thank you very much for your assistance this morning, and thank you everyone for joining us. I look forward to seeing you all again next time. Bye.